I am so excited to moderate this discussion today. I can't think of better folks to make this to bring this topic to life on All Tech is Humans platform. I'd love to take a moment to just introduce the panelists. Joining me today is Imran Ahmed, founder and CEO of the Center for Countering Digital Hate. Imran is an authority on social and psychological malignancies on social media, such as identity-based hate, extremism, disinformation, conspiracy theories. He also regularly appears in the media and in documentaries as an expert in how bad actors use digital spaces to harm others and benefit themselves, as well as how bad platforms kind of allow that behavior. Also, we have Maggie Munts, the Director of Public Affairs and Impact at Truepic. Truepic is a technology company dedicated to authenticity and transparency in digital content. At Truepic, Maggie oversees strategic partnerships, public policy, and global social impact programming. Previously, Maggie led marketplace and product strategies at Amazon to protect customers and build brands. Maggie is also a member of the Trust and Safety Professional Association, +1 to that, and the Integrity Institute. She received her master's in international affairs and technology policy from Columbia University and her bachelor's in international relations from Pomona College. Last but not least, Danny Siegel is a malicious actors analyst. He is also a Columbia University researcher who focuses on how extremist groups and state actors are using artificial intelligence to influence operations. His influential work has been recently featured in the New York Times, the Global Network on Extremism and Technology, and he also has investigations in the wild, including, in which AI models are exploited to spread disinformation, target vulnerable audiences, and manipulate individuals. Danny has also previously shared his expertise with tech platforms and delivered key insights at international forums, including The Hague. Light work, Danny, and Maggie, and Imran. So today, I'm so excited to get into this conversation on malicious actors and AI. I really want to start with just some level setting with the audience on how we're defining malicious actors in this discussion, and also maybe in some of your work. And also bring in the definition at its intersection with educational spaces as it relates to youth. So Danny, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's, a really important question, because I think very often the term malicious actor is kind of just thrown around. How I like to view malicious actors are individuals who are taking active efforts in using AI to undermine democratic processes. Whether you're thinking about actors like China or Russia, that a lot of experimentation is happening right now to figure out how this technology can be used to make their influence operations a lot more effective. Any type of use of AI that perpetuates particular harassment. This is most commonly now that we've seen in the form of deepfake nudes or NCII, or just use the technology to enable self-gain at the expense of others. I think what's particularly concerning these days is very often individuals look at malicious actors who are potentially creating satirical content, whether it's like the Joe Biden or Donald Trump gamer memes, or a variety of other content that is really just an evolution of political cartoons. And I think we have to be particularly careful of drawing the line of figuring out when is it just satirical and an evolution of political cartoons to when we're looking at content that is actively trying to manipulate reality and create a weaponized unreality where actors can benefit in a thriving disinformation space.
And Maggie, in your work, this obviously comes up. What do you have to add, or what's your reaction?
One of the things I would say is sort of in the traditional realm of identifying cyber threat actors, whether that's nation states, whether that's kind of hacktivist type individuals, whether that's actors who have kind of economic motivations in some way, shape, or form. We really do see all of those at play in terms of interacting with synthetic media and AI generated content and using that as a way to further their own ends, whatever those might be. I think one of the things that's important to acknowledge is there's the content itself and then the actor behind it. The combination of those two in some cases can truly be malicious, whereas the combination of, an individual who's playing around with an open source model and, create something that kind of falls in that gray area that Danny is talking about. I don't know that we can necessarily deem that malicious. I don't know that that's fair. But there are combinations, I would say, of actor, content, and behavior that certainly are malicious in their intent and in that combination. And I think that's sort of the intersection that we need to look at here.
And staying with you, Maggie, obviously the current state is constantly evolving. What is the current state with tracing the origins of content and the history of digital content online? And could you expand on the vulnerabilities that exist in the current landscape that malicious actors are exploiting?
Sure. So I would say, candidly, the current landscape is quite mixed right now. In terms of deceptive, manipulated content, there's a long history there and it's very storied. When we think about heavy editing technologies that predated what we see as now sort of the generative AI boom, bad actors have been using these for a long time for things like fraud, scamming, etc. And in terms of tracing those origins historically and also still currently, a lot of that is actually pretty labor intensive. It's why we see visual forensics teams in newsrooms. It's why we need wonderful researchers like Danny and others who are really looking into where some of this more malicious content, furthered by malicious actors, is actually coming from. So I would say it's mixed. There's also an emerging space around content authenticity and provenance, transparency in digital content that is shifting some of those dynamics, kind of preemptively and proactively labeling and marking content upstream to say, hey, this is where it came from. This is how it was created. This is maybe when it was created as well. So that, researchers online, folks who are interacting with that content in the wild, be it in a newsroom or potentially on social media channels, have some semblance of transparency in terms of where it came from. We're seeing more kind of commercial generative AI platforms start to label their content using things like the C2PA standard and watermarking, which is creating at least some level of transparency. But candidly, I would say if we look across the whole kind of internet and the full landscape, it is pretty mixed. It's still pretty labor intensive to actually identify the origins of digital content. There are tools and tooling that kind of help with proactively labeling, but then also reactively kind of detecting and figuring out where something came from that a lot of open source researchers will make use of and take advantage of, which is great. But I think in terms of the vulnerabilities, there are many. It's pretty easy to recontextualize an image in today's day and age. And whether that's wiping the metadata off of a file, cropping an image in a misleading way, a lot of these techniques have long predated what generative AI and synthetic media and deepfakes have put into sharp focus in the last 2 years. But I think this problem set has kind of existed for a while, which is why companies like Truepic and others are really devoted to the solution space to make sure that there is sort of more transparency online, at least in certain spaces, right? I think ultimately one of the things we talk a lot about is what's of kind of high consequence or content of consequence that's maybe being used for decision making, is highly influential in terms of how people are going to behave, that sort of a thing.
I love your mention of content of consequence because it makes me think of Imran's team's extensive work on the platform design flaws that allow these harmful narratives to infiltrate vulnerable populations, but mostly youth. Imran, could you jump in and share about the research findings there and what you're seeing concerning youth?
Yeah, I mean, well, look, first of all, thank you so much for putting this on and putting together such a fantastic panel. It's great to be with Maggie and Danny and with you, Sandra. CCDH has been looking at the ways in which bad actors can weaponize digital spaces for 7 years now as an organization. And AI is no different in some respects in that it's a new tool that can be used by anyone who chooses to use it, and also by vulnerable populations who may not understand that what they're getting from an artificial intelligence system is actually really dumb. So, I mean, I could give you examples of forums that we've looked at where people with eating disorders or disordered eating will talk to each other about how they can use AI to generate for them a 700-calorie eating plan, and the AI has no guardrails on it, and so will do so. I think we're very good as an organization at producing those really, really catchy examples, the ones that stick in the mind. but there was one where we asked it how we could achieve a certain physique, and the AI platform suggested that the child takes heroin because that's how you achieve a heroin chic look. But we also see that, a more profound problem here, that for young people who use social media on average, 14 to 17-year-olds in the US for 4.8 hours a day, one of the challenges of AI is that it allows for the almost zero cost generation of unlimited amounts of content. And if you think about the economics of social media, the economics of social media are unique. They are a profound shift in the way that we communicate as a species, because we now have a technology that has zero marginal cost for each additional message to each additional person. You can post something and it can go to 1 billion people and you pay nothing for it. But the challenge always was producing that content in the first instance. So when we studied bad actors, for example, anti-vaxxers, back during the pandemic, they spend enormous amounts of money on laboratories which are testing, doing constant A/B testing of messages to work out what's the most persuasive or dissuasive from persuading people not to take vaccines, for example, or not to trust conventional health authorities. Now, AI changes that, because you don't need a laboratory that's doing all that testing. What you actually have is a zero marginal cost for the production of that content as well. So if we are in the nuclear age of communications, where, as with uranium, from a tiny speck of uranium, you can create enormous amounts of devastation. We have the zero marginal cost for each additional message to each additional person. The AI age, when combined with the social media age, takes us into the thermonuclear age, because we've got a fission reaction, causing that fusion reaction, and that means we've got unlimited sort of potential to devastate the information ecosystem, to absolutely flood it with highly tailored content. And that can be individually tailored for each individual person, because your cost is zero. And so you're constantly tracking just one thing, engagement, and producing content in an automated fashion. Now, that's what really, really worries me, is that you turn the information ecosystem into chaos. And what Maggie talked about there, which was really interesting, about some people saying that they're going to voluntarily watermark. Well, actually, if some companies voluntarily watermark, that actually undermines our ability to be able to detect content that is produced by platforms that don't watermark. If we start to assume that most good platforms will watermark, actually, it's bad actors will gravitate to those platforms that don't. And it's one of the reasons why we're very, very keen on having statutory regulatory frameworks for these companies, so that you actually create that level playing field. It's something that Sam Altman himself has called for: transparency and accountability for these companies.
Yeah, I would love to stay with you on that, because I know CCDH has put out something called the STAR framework, which supports structural enhancements and algorithmic safeguards. Could you speak to some of those findings in the STAR framework, and what you think social media platforms should do to kind of bolster their resilience there?
Yeah, so I mean, if the core problems of generative AI models are sort of reduced friction to create the disinformation, a failure to curate the information that goes into the models, so you've got this garbage in, garbage out problem, and a failure to apply rules based on human experience, that any adult, if ever faced with a child, any intelligent human being, if ever faced with a child saying that they want to starve themselves to death, would say, please don't. Would not say, well, here's an eating plan that will kill you, over the next 6 months to a year. That's not based on hard-earned societal knowledge and values, and doesn't have the guardrails on production. Our argument is that the same framework that we initially developed with lawmakers from the Five Eyes countries, so the US, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the EU, in 2022, at our STAR conference in Washington, where we brought all those lawmakers who hadn't seen each other in 2 years because of the pandemic together into one space, and said, what have we learned from the pandemic? What have we learned over the last few years? And how can we build a de minimis framework that will comprehensively help us to deal with social media, but also will not violate the First Amendment? The principles that underpin the STAR framework are that transparency can lead to meaningful accountability, which allows us where there is negligence to then hold them economically responsible, and that creates a culture of safety by design. So STAR. And the same principles can be applied really easily to artificial intelligence as well. That transparency, for example, libraries of the content that they produce, so we can go back and check whether or not images were generated by a particular platform or not. Accountability to, and that really in the US means having either an FCC for this, an FCC for social media / AI, or it is empowering our select committees in Congress to be more effective at asking questions that don't appear like they were literally written by AI because they're so profoundly stupid at times. And then being able to hold them economically responsible. Now, there's the question of Section 230 when it comes to social media companies. It isn't clear whether Section 230 would apply to a generative AI platform, given that they are essentially generating novel content themselves. But being able to hold them economically responsible where they do cause a systemic harm or they cause harm to a number of individuals, I think is really, really important. And if they do so, negligently, knowing that they could have averted that harm, but not having invested into it, would create a culture of safety by design. And I think that given the power of AI, if we don't get off our butts now and start thinking about what that de minimis regulatory framework that would allow for these companies to prosper financially, and I'm not saying companies can't make money. Good for them if they're going to make money out of their brilliance and their genius. But at the same time, surely we can do that without making the people that bear the cost for the negative externalities of these companies in every instance being us, the people.
Yeah, that speaks really nicely to our discussion here about the cases for open and closed sourced AI models, given how there's a challenging context for both. Danny, I would love for you to speak to those instances in which closed source and open source models have been manipulated and kind of get into what we can learn from both.
Yeah, I'll go into that in 1 second. One of the things that I want to kind of clarify as well, especially when we're thinking about what the future looks like down the line when it comes to malicious actors using artificial intelligence to improve disinformation, improve their influence operations, whether it's China, whether it's Russia, whether it's extremist groups, whether it's just individuals online wanting to cause chaos and hate. The quote unquote information environment and the content that then becomes just flooded with low quality content enables malicious actors to push more effective messaging and information as the information environment is so polluted. So one of the examples that I've seen most recently, and there's a lot of research on just kind of for lack of a better way of saying it, the end-shitification of the internet, is I've looked at a variety of videos being pushed out on a variety of platforms of different cartoon characters and different popular YouTubers singing Islamic State and Al-Qaeda nasheeds. And what's really fascinating about this is it has really, really high engagement. And it's this voice cloning technology that enables it to get such high engagement. And the individuals that are pushing them out, you would think maybe it's just for the meme of it, but they're directly linked to official Telegram accounts linked to the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda. So there is some sort of coordination taking place, maybe not officially, but with just affiliates or supporters. But because the environment becomes so ripened with all of this content, and because the malicious actors, in this case, Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, are able to use this technology to directly target individuals, in this case, particularly the youth, it can highlight or just be able to spread way more rapidly than what we've seen before. And the algorithms play a part in this as well. I mean, algorithms is a form of closed source AI, right? If I'm directly giving you stuff that is characters that you're interested in, whether it's SpongeBob or Walter White, right? You are going to be looking at more of this content because that's the general content that you want to be looking at. So in terms of closed source AI, that's one of the ways I think we need to be thinking about it more specifically, more than just generative AI. Open source technologies, particularly around voice cloning or just the creation of images, is something I'm particularly concerned about because I think stripping away the safety features on these models can enable groups to, kind of create systems that are able to create chaos. But what I think is really, really awesome as well when it comes to open source AI is it also enables people to develop systems for content moderation to prevent this enshittification of the internet, to enable us to be able to catch the malicious actors a lot more effectively. And I think both of those conversations need to be taking place where we're able to recognize the benefits and the harms, and in the long term, like continue to progress on the internet, but continue to invest in resources to make sure that at the end of the day, the internet is becoming the prosperous environment that, like Section 230 in its existence, meant to protect and create.
Yeah, and I see the chat blowing up on that point, so I'm sure we'll have some great audience engagement to continue that kind of debate around open and closed source. But I want to stay with you because you've done extensive research on the information environment and what you're calling enshittification of the information. The dissemination is also a very scary point, right? Because it's increasingly getting sophisticated. It's getting it proliferates at scale in scary ways, right? So, is there a concern about, in the future or even now, AI generating its own misinformation and sharing it at scale? What are folks saying in that sense?
Yeah, I mean, thinking about like AI in the future is like very, very tough because it's I think very often our conversations are very like speculative as like what happens next. I think in terms of hallucinations, that's something we have to like definitely worry about. Um, However, like what I'm like most concerned about is how this technology enables better targeting and messaging as well, right? If you are able to at scale create mass amounts of content that can synthesize a particular message that textually probably wouldn't gain so much at scale because it's just boring to read text, let's be honest. Um, it enables these groups to just push conspiratorial thinking in a lot more of an effective way. And something that's also true is it enables them to blend in the environment and maybe not necessarily seem or just seem more inconspicuous than they typically would.
Yeah, that's really well received in terms of thinking about mitigating the risks associated. Maggie, I want to come to you with that sort of thinking, bouncing off of what Danny said, thinking about the resilient future that we do want in this space. What are you thinking about, like an ideal end state for the mitigation of risks associated with AI? And given that there are a lack of business incentives at this point to share that knowledge between companies, is there recourse we can expect to see with regulatory developments as well?
So I'm going to start this by saying that I'm generally an optimist in a lot of ways. I think we do live in a moment right now where we do need to very much be thinking about the risks that come with these AI systems, what they can generate, agentic AI, all of that. I also think it's really important to highlight the fact that Danny has already cited on this live stream a lot of concrete examples of how these systems are actually being abused and misused. Because I think one of the sort of most common lines of defense in terms of not taking action is saying, well, this is still theoretical. We don't actually know. And the truth is we actually do. And there's research being done and there are examples that are very clear where this AI is being used in ways that are in some ways quite nefarious, really concerning. And we need to be sort of solving for those problems. Now, that said, I think a lot of the sort of challenges in our information ecosystem have been chronic and might continue to be chronic. Where I am really optimistic, though, is seeing industry move towards coalescing around certain standards and certain best practices, in many ways moving much faster than policy, because that's what industry is able to do, is ultimately move faster, being on the front lines of some of this stuff. So examples there would be, there has been a lot of coalescence around C2PA, the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, and the interoperable standard that organization supports. We've seen organizations like Google, Meta, OpenAI recently make announcements around kind of using that standard as a way to mark content upstream. But upstream is only really one part of that equation. When we look at a more resilient future online, it's very much going to require a multi-layered approach that's not just technical too. I think all too often we talk about technology as a silver bullet, and it is not. C2PA is not a silver bullet. I will be the first person to say that. Neither is watermarking. Ultimately, with these technologies, we need to make sure that they're layered so we can approach kind of what I would call a defense in depth strategy online, so that we have kind of multiple lines of defense, multiple ways in which we're mitigating risk. Upstream solutions are part of that, actually marking content in the moments that it's created in a way that's resilient and interoperable. But also we need to think about downstream and the detection ecosystem. Largely for bad actors, that's the space we're going to play in a lot of the time. Bad actors are not going to mark their content. Imran said it. They're going to go to open source models that don't use those technologies. And so we're going to need to think about kind of more sophisticated detection models. And the thing with detection, though, is that it is ultimately probabilistic. So it doesn't operate in certainty. People are going to make kind of a best judgment decision, and you very much need human in the loop for that, and kind of human oversight for any of that detection. And then beyond that, I would say we are in a moment that's going to require media and AI literacy and kind of education. So this type of live stream is excellent. I think one of the things about media literacy is that it's actually allowed to be fun, I would say. I just anecdotally over the weekend, I promise I didn't plan to say this, but I saw The Fall Guy with Ryan Gosling. I don't know if anybody on the live stream has seen it, but there's this excellent kind of media literacy moment in the movie. There's actually a couple where they educate on deepfakes and their risks. There's a moment in the movie, this doesn't give away the plot, where someone is deepfaked in a way that really puts their kind of life, livelihood, and well-being in jeopardy. And that's scary, but also very feasible in today's day and age. It's basically just a face swap. There's also a lot of commentary in terms of, what AI is doing to creative industries and creative communications in general. I would recommend seeing it, but that moment, that's media literacy in action, actually. And it was really accessible. It was really entertaining. And I think we need to see more of that as well, just so that people are educated about these technologies. And it's important that we also don't go too far in the direction of scare tactics, right? Because I do think one of the things that kind of currently pervades our media ecosystem is a lot of ambiguity. So we don't necessarily know the origins of something or not, unless it came from a clearly authenticating system, clearly marked and clearly readable. A lot of times that ambiguity is still pretty prevalent. And until we move to a future where there are spaces where there's kind of clearly authenticated content that's authenticated in a way that people understand and are interacting with, that ambiguity creates openings for bad actors who aren't necessarily even technical, calling content into question. The liar's dividend, I think we're going to see at play increasingly more and more. And so drawing certain lines technically and socially around the content that actually was created, for example, by light hitting a camera lens and not generated, and making sure there's ways to communicate, that's really important. That's been a lot of Truepic's work historically. But I would say that right now that ambiguity is really challenging. And so educating on it in ways that, don't have people mistrusting everything that they see online, but have people actively questioning and actively engaging with it, I think is really important. So I would say, for a more resilient future, we really need to see a landscape where technical, social, and policy solutions are kind of all overlapping. And to answer sort of the second part of your question, Sandra, around incentives for industry, knowing that there's not necessarily a lot of information sharing around some of the behaviors that are being seen on platforms, et cetera. Regulation, I think we have to see that move forward ultimately there. And that's a longer term thing.
Can I make a point about
Go for it.
And I hear this a lot, like the idea that people should be cautious when they go online because they don't know something's being faked or not. You're kidding me? Do you know how much nonsense there is online? I don't have the time and I don't have the skill to do it. So either one of two things happens. Either I believe it or I give up believing in what I see and hear with my own ears and eyes. One of my colleagues, Irina, she grew up in the Soviet Union and moved to Maryland when she was young. She's phenomenal intellect, and PhD in political economy. And she and I talk about this all the time, about what it was like growing up and for her parents in the Soviet Union. And the key to the information ecosystem there wasn't that it was just propagandistic, it's that it was chaotic. It was impossible to discern what was true or not because they would inject uncertainty And so in the chaos, in the maelstrom of uncertainty, that generates an apathy that makes people hold on to whatever is strong and certain, which is the dictator. And that's how, we start to see our societies melt. The consensus, the things that bind us. There is a Hobbesian element to this, that if you can't trust what you see or hear, you fear other people. You fear what they might be thinking. And that is really bad. My grandfather comes from, grew up in Afghanistan, and he fought in the Second World War and came to Britain, fought for the good guys, not the bad guys, in the Second World War, came to Britain. He wrote to me before he died and told me how quickly that country had collapsed from a country in which women had been in government, and he loved ladies. So he says, like, there's girls in miniskirts in Kabul, and then it disappeared, which I think he was more upset about. But the democracies can collapse, and there are signs of this already. Like, we should be able to see the sort of the earthquakes happening, the unusual weather patterns in our information ecosystem, whether it is things like Brexit, the assassination of my colleague Joe Cox MP, which drove me into this work in the first instance, by a man who was radicalized online. But there are icebergs melting, and we should be aware of them. One of the biggest that terrifies me is polling that we did last year looking at young people in the US and UK compared to adults. And we found that 14 to 17-year-olds were more likely to believe conspiracy theories. We tested 9 different conspiracy theories than adults. And 14 to 17-year-olds who spend more than 5 hours a day on social media, and the average in the US is 4.8 hours a day, they were even more likely. So, for example, with an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, 34% of adults believe that Jews have disproportionate control of our economy and our politics, 43% of 14 to 17-year-olds, and 54% of 14 to 17-year-olds who are heavy social media users. The key variable there being social media use. And what scares me is that with AI coming into the equation as well, with an ever more chaotic information ecosystem, in which people are being told the lie that if they just look harder, that they can work out what the truth is, because it's just not true most of the time. I am worried that we are already seeing the signs of the window for us to fix this closing. Because if a generation that believes the things that we found them to believe continues to be true, we're in deep trouble. And I do think that we're going to have to think much more radically than just about giving people an hour of education in school to be careful when they go online. I think about things like the right to good information, which underpins all of our other rights, our sexual and reproductive rights, our health rights, our right to life, the most important right, And I think to myself, well, actually, in an age in which disinformation is free and can be spread at pace, overwhelming our ability to fact check and to discern what's true or not, I think that a positive right to good information and one that you can actually enforce through the courts against those companies who are making vast amounts of money, who vitiate that right, who take that right away from you, who may harm you as a result. I think that unless we start to think in much more radical ways, we're in really big trouble.
I do want to just clarify too, in terms of when I say media literacy, really what I mean with that is making sure people are aware of what these technologies can do and can't do, just so that they can approach their everyday day-to-day life online with a little bit more skepticism in this moment. And Imran, I agree with you. We are in a moment where there are catastrophic risks that are on the table. And are not necessarily outside the realm of possibility anymore in the way that they were a couple of years ago, with how sophisticated and accessible and efficient some of these technologies have become. And I think that that is so important to acknowledge. I also would say it's one of those things when we look at the trust and safety landscape more broadly as it exists today, one of the complaints that I hear from peers who are in that industry and at some of these large companies is that internally they have to make a business case for some of the decisions they could make that would make these platforms better. And I think some of what you're highlighting truly genuinely is the business case for authenticity, the business case for trust and safety, because ultimately if we don't clean up some of these digital environments, people are going to start to leave them. And Danny, as you were saying, malicious actors are going to start to have a field day. And that's not necessarily a digital world I want to live in at all. And so I do think it's really important to acknowledge that in it, like the democratic consequences, the societal consequences are grave, potentially, of this going wrong. And at the same time, there's also a business case in terms of how people interact with these platforms increasingly. And I think there's some research actually happening on this right now at Stanford. What kind of AI content actually shows up in our news feeds day to day? I think for me, it's a lot of like puppies, baby animals, fake vacation scenes, like fake landscapes of travel, et cetera, et cetera. That kind of shows you what I follow offline. It's pretty vanilla. Now that said, I don't really want to see that. My human eye can't really tell. I just have kind of a hunch and a feeling in my gut that it isn't real, like something's not right. But there have been many studies done that show that human senses can't distinguish AI from not. We're past that. We've crossed the uncanny valley months ago, maybe even a year ago. Like we're far, far past that. But I think in terms of my interest in engaging with the platform, when I see some of that, I personally am starting to disengage more. And I think that's something we need to talk about. That said, there's the flip side of that where people see something that is AI synthetic. Maybe AI has been used to change it into their native language. So then it's suddenly more appealing to them and it's pulling them deeper into that world. So, I mean, it's nuanced. There's a lot of complexity here, but I do think in this, there also is a business case for more robust trust and safety at these platforms, which in a moment where we need policy to still catch up, I think is something that's worth noting and talking about more ultimately in some of these conversations.
Yeah, I was going to say one of the things that I think is particularly dangerous, jumping off of what Maggie was talking about, is the generational difference, I think, of how this technology impacts us, particularly younger generations. I think for a long term, people assumed or had a greater assumption that they were less susceptible to dis and misinformation. And I think that is being proven to not be true today. And AI is making that a whole lot worse. In the first regard, younger people understand the threat AI poses. So younger people like to just call things AI when they might not necessarily be AI. I think that's happening across generations, but I think just because they're more tuned into technology, they're becoming more distrustful because the technology is evolving at a rapid rate when we're not even sure we're going to reach the world of a weaponized unreality, which some people think might happen, but may not happen. At least right now, we just have this like weird online internet getting weirder. And I think what's particularly concerning is in the younger generations, you're going to have large amounts of them that shrug, say they don't know it's true, don't turn out to vote, don't turn out to really politically engage or do anything. And then you'll have a lot of individuals who will just call things AI when they're not AI and accuse everyone of politicization of a particular subject. And then you'll have individuals that spend a lot of time looking online to uncover the facts. And unfortunately, the threshold for just figuring out what's real these days is pretty high, which is why I think it's especially important younger generations learn more about things like open source intelligence and like trying to look at everything with skepticism, but in a way that is, doing it for the purpose of finding truth rather than just hoping that there's a context note at the end of every single tweet or like Instagram post that they see. That's something I'm really supportive of. And as a former teacher, I think is a great way of introducing media literacy in a non-political way in the classroom, because it really inspires young people to question the world around them, as they should be doing just generally, learn critical thinking, and like learn what is and what is not synthetic, and sometimes not know the answer to those questions, but always be respectful while doing so.
Yeah, I love your point about seeking truth, not seeking the AI sort of tag, because it's learning. We as a society need to be more discerning in the content that we come across and the media that we consume. I really liked your point, Maggie, also about the technical, social, and policy solutions kind of working in tandem, like different layers to create what you were saying was defense in depth. I appreciated that point, because we at All Tech is Human are constantly amplifying the technical individuals, but also maybe the folks who might be on the Hill. CCDH does a ton of work on to expand its policy arm and get more involvement from legislators who really desperately need this kind of expert insights and support where they're not sufficiently upskilled. I can also say that media literacy being brought up in the movie is like a very interesting case study of how it was received. I think we should see more of that right now, especially in the context of youth. I think a lot of onus is being put on parental guidance, and the adoption rates of such programs is quite low. So, kind of thinking through what, also to Danny's point, the more non-politicized but also unique ways to introduce these topics and support greater discernment as a society is so critical for our democratic health. I know we have a ton of questions in the comments. I do want to speak to just one more question about, what do you think the policy space should look like moving forward? Sometimes I find that, and it's not on any organization on this call, but sometimes I do find it's hard for recommendations from civil society orgs, from nonprofits, to reach the platforms in a way that understands their internal infrastructure and can be actually applied. And so there's like a lack of information translation from recommendation to actual implementation at the platform, right? We saw this in the AI generated CSAM guidelines project with Thorn. So we actually brought together a task force alongside Thorn of these big AI companies to help direct the guidelines a little bit in a way that's interoperable with their systems. So I would like to get just a quick take from everyone on where we want to see the policy space going, knowing that there's like a need for that kind of info translation in between.
I mean, if I can make the point about the companies, I started my career at Merrill Lynch. One of the things I liked about working in finance is that you don't pretend that you're there to save the world. You're there to make money, and it's really, really clear. But the logic is the same at the C-suite of any of these companies too. They're there to make money. Let's not pretend that they're there to inform the world. I mean, if it was free speech, Mark Zuckerberg wouldn't be worth $100 billion, and he's younger than I am. I mean, someone's paying for it. And I do find that the notion that we can persuade through moral persuasion or shame these companies into acting is kind of, it's not like to work. I mean, in fact, one of the few mechanisms that we found in the United States is advertiser pressure, and at CCDH we absolutely know what happens if we did a study, for example, when Elon Musk took over X, showing that the use of the N-word increased 202%, and last year he sued us for doing that research, not because it was wrong, but because we did the research itself. And I'm very glad to say that a few weeks ago, a court in California dismissed that claim against us and awarded us costs. But these companies are unwilling to change unless you change the fundamental economic incentives that underpin them. And that's what regulation is there for. And it's also what advertiser pressure and commercial pressures can be brought to bear. The question of how we deploy those pressures and do so in a way that is cognizant of the First Amendment. I think the STAR framework's a really effective mechanism for doing that, because you create the transparency. It allows brilliant people like Daniel to research and do that really interesting intellectual, that sort of academic research. Allows organizations at CCDH to look at the harms and do that sort of red team analysis, the bad actor analysis. It gives the ammunition to people in the trust and safety functions to actually put that pressure on their companies. But we also need to have much more meaningful sanctions available when companies do vitiate the rights of normal people. It means being able to hold them accountable like any other company for negligence, for product design liability that cause harm to others. And I think that if we can get this right, if we can actually create a way in which they are subject to the same laws as the rest of America, we might be in a better place than we are right now. Are we getting closer to it? I think we are. I said to my team this year that I think we're in a tipping point on things like Section 230. I think that for the first time in the last 7 years, I feel that we're now over the hump, that people realize that we just can't carry on as we are. And so the approach that we use is to highlight that, is to use the particular harms that really catch the imagination and horrify people, and then drive that through into policy solutions. But we need a lot more of us arguing on the Hill, and anyone that isn't at the moment, in whatever capacity they can do so, we can help. We can put on, we can introduce people to people on the Hill. We can put on road shows where experts can go and meet with those people, but we just need to overwhelm them. Because I tell you who is overwhelming them right now. The other side. It's the tech companies. It's the AI platforms. They are spending unbelievable amounts of money to gaslight, mislead, and protect their ability to profit at the expense of people. And that is our biggest challenge right now, is how do we actually use the truth to overwhelm their disinformation and lies?
In terms of the policy environment and kind of what we're seeing right now, I would say there actually are some, I can speak to kind of the area that I have sort of specific expertise and knowledge in, and that's really around transparency in AI systems and their outputs. I do think that we've seen some meaningful legislation come out of the EU with the EU's AI Act, requiring that systems actually, disclose when you're interacting with AI so that humans actually know when that's happening and they have that information. I think the White House executive order from October also has a lot of really important language around content authenticity and provenance, not just kind of disclosure in AI systems, but how are we also protecting like real media of consequence that's being used for decision making around the world and that people are relying on in some capacity. And so I think we've seen some really good movement there. Also at the state level across the US, there are a number of states now that have legislation of some sort that's either in a proposed, passed, et cetera, to deal with some of sort of the most egregious harms and risks when we think about AI and deepfakes, potentially in political advertising, but then also for things like NCII and CSAM and those really, really egregious harms. So that is encouraging to me that we're actually seeing movement in that direction, both at the state and federal level in the US. And very much agree in terms of needing to have a genuinely multi-stakeholder approach. We do need technical voices in the room because these systems are developing quickly and they have a lot of complexities. And we need also to just make sure we're taking the time to actually really talk about them in ways that ask the right questions, really get into the right details, because the thing that's going to happen after any policy actually passes is we're going to need to enforce it. And that could get really complex really quickly. And so I think that's actually something that we need to start talking about more in the policy conversation is, okay, so now what? In terms of, what the actual consequences are and how you actually trace and attribute potentially malicious content to the malicious actor in question. With, we had this case recently with a school in Maryland where the athletic director deepfaked the principal and had him saying things that he did not say in a really unbecoming way. And it took months for that investigation to really proceed and happen. And so that's we could have a whole nother live stream on that in terms of, what is this doing to evidentiary standards? What is this doing to courts of law? How do we actually enforce these policies once they're passed? And there's lots of nuance that we really need to tease out, which isn't necessarily fun, but is going to be really necessary in some of the hard work of policy making here.
Yeah, and I very much welcome a follow-up conversation to this, especially given the importance of keeping up with the actual enforcement and implementation. Danny, jump in.
Yeah, I think on a policy perspective, the first thing we need to be thinking about is the low-hanging fruit, right? Like, what can everyone get on board with that thinks is horrible and wrong, and let's tackle those and then worry about the long-term things later, because I think the long-term things are long-term. We should be able to focus on them, but there's some very clear immediate things that can be focused on. The first thing that I think, that is awesome that Truepic is doing, and a variety of other companies in the space, is just focusing on provenance, right? There's no reason why government communications, as well as just like companies, cannot have as easy an option to like have content provenance on their devices. It would go a really, really long way in enabling individuals to, one, learn about AI and learn about how like deepfake technology could potentially mislead people, just simply because on your phone or on your tablet or on your camera, you have the ability of protecting your photos so that way everyone knows that they're legitimate. That actually in and of itself does a lot of media literacy work beyond just like having it taught in the classroom. It opens up the conversation, it's discourse. I think the particular thing that is concerning and how this argument needs to be made is, I don't know if anybody's ever tried to find like a used mattress online or gone to something like Craigslist and you just don't have a ton of information. I don't want my news environment to look like how it is to try and find information on Temu related to a product, right? That's the world that we're heading into, because we just don't know what's legitimate, what's not, or what's true and what's not. And sure, maybe I end up buying a table that is like dirtier than I thought it would be in the picture. But like, what ends up happening when I am, trying to find out information a couple hours before I'm going into the polling center? That makes a difference, particularly when malicious actors are at play. A great example of this is I did an investigation a little while back, looking at actors on 4chan who were creating content of a Louisiana pardon and parole live stream. And on this live stream, they were creating audio files of the judges engaging in extremely horrific, like racist tirades. And they were just humorously posting them online. And it was for satirical purpose, but it could very easily, one of those audio files, slip into, a local newspaper and wreak havoc, like what Maggie was just talking about happened to the school board. So engaging this technology in a humorous way can get really, really dark really quickly, especially when you think about like the lack of resources within local journalism. Another example of something that I think we're seeing some work on the Hill is related to NCII and CSAM, synthetic content meant to particularly damage individuals' reputations, largely vulnerable communities like women, is something that needs to be existent in already existing defamation law, or just sped up to deal with differently. Because the moment you see those types of images, it discredits the individual that you're looking at often. And that is very, very damning. Beyond just the political consequences or the economic consequences, it's just hurtful towards individuals. And there needs to be some change around that, because unlike things like revenge porn, you can do this in a couple of seconds and create images at scale, like what you saw to like Taylor Swift. So that is something that I think, again, low-hanging fruit that we could very easily be having conversations with to deal with. And then, one of the things that I'm really passionate about is having conversations about things like cognitive security issues. There is no reason why Democrats and Republicans can't get on board to say, here are our adversaries and here's how they could use AI technology to destroy our democracy. Focus on the adversaries everybody can agree is bad within Congress. And then we can start having conversations as how this technology can wreak havoc on our democracy, wreak havoc on our individual economy, and just overall wreak havoc on particular communities. If we're attacking the low-hanging fruit first, we can have the long-term conversations later. But those, in my opinion, are the biggest threats that we have at face when it comes to this technology.
Yeah, I appreciate your insights there. I think any step in the right direction is a step, right? Like, we shouldn't just say it's a big issue, it's going to take time, and like buy time in that sense. So I'm completely in agreement with making steps, even if they're small. I want to thank you all for joining today's live stream. I know there was a ton of great questions in the audience, and the time got away from us having this great conversation. So would love to bring you all back one day and keep this conversation going and talk about enforcement of insights there. Thank you, Imran. Thank you, Danny. Thank you, Maggie. It was such a pleasure. And for those watching, please visit us at alltechishuman.org and get involved. Thank you.